Ready to go.
All right, here we go. Welcome to the smartest people in the room. We are so glad you are here with us, and just by showing up, you are already demonstrating your very own smarts. Today, we feature two guests that I have stalked to appear on this platform for quite some time. You're going to be glad they finally slowed down long enough to make it here. Before we get started, let me take care of some business. First, to the audience, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat window. The reason we do these webinars is twofold. First, we want to showcase really smart people and the amazing work they do day to day in the industry. But the second reason is a bit more nuanced. Most of you know that I am a music industry headhunter. I place music executives in roles throughout the industry. So by definition and function, I help people connect with companies. In this series, my goal is to help you make more connections, and I invite you to take full advantage of that opportunity. Specifically, I invite you to engage with the speakers and the other attendees in the chat of the Zoom. Please introduce yourselves, share your LinkedIn profile, say hello to your friends, and make some new ones. And ask questions of our speakers. We will try to address as many of those as possible along during the interview. And also, please make sure your chat is set to address speakers and attendees. I want to thank our program sponsors, for without their support, we could not keep this free. I want to thank First Horizon Bank, Bufkin Baker, Four Roses Bourbon, the Fairlane Hotel, the Tennessee Entertainment Commission, Lightning 100, Tennessee Brew Works, Moo TV, Jive Printing, Project Music, and Cushmaster's brand of CBD products. So let's get down to business. In today's host seat, we welcome Fiona Bloom. Fiona, I've been stalking for 4 years to appear on this program, so I'm so glad she's here. She's a promoter, publicist, radio personality, party planner, marketer, voiceover talent, host and MC, venue booker, playlist curator, lecturer, and natural tastemaker. Throughout her 30-year career, Fiona has become quite a master of all musical trades. Under her full-service boutique agency, The Bloom Effect offers consulting, publicity, A&R and management advice, and specializes in entertainment marketing and branding that has produced and promoted more than 2,000 special events for artists, authors, fashion labels, and other lifestyle brands, in addition to working with more than 300 artist campaigns. Prior to life in the business, she was a concert pianist, violinist, and widely popular radio personality. She's also an educator, past adjunct professor at LIU Brooklyn, and mastered the art of connecting and developed a music entrepreneurship curriculum. Welcome, Fiona. So glad you're here. And joining Fiona as today's featured guest is Steve Bloom. Despite the same last name, they are not related. Steve is a longtime journalist and author with 32 years in the cannabis community. A partial list of his many credits include editor-in-chief of Marijuana Goes Mainstream and the Complete Guide to CBD, publisher of celebstoner.com, one of the leading sources for marijuana and celebrity news on the web since 2007, former editor of High Times from 1988 to 2007, and producer of the Stony and Doobie Award shows and 2 Hempilation benefit albums for Normal while at High Times. He's a recipient of Normal's Media and Culture Award in 2004, Cannabis MVP by the Cannabis Business Awards in 2018, and New York Normal Activism Award in 2019. Please welcome these 2 amazing guests to the smartest people in the room. Take it away, Fiona.
All right. Hi, thanks, Tom. I'm so happy to be here. And thank you to everybody that's tuning in. You all are the smartest people in the room. I am really, really, really excited about this conversation. It's really incredible to be with a legend in the cannabis and music space. And goodness, it's so timely. I mean, we have 420 around the corner next Tuesday, and New York State has just legalized recreational marijuana. So this couldn't be a better time to be having this conversation. Steve Bloom, Bloomy, how are you? Where are you?
Hey there, Bloomy. Yes, it's good news in New York right now. I am in New York. I'm in the Bronx.
In the boogie down. I see an incredible bookshelf of amazing books, which we're going to talk about a couple of them later. But more importantly, I see a ton of vinyl in your other room over there. Could you tell us about that incredible collection?
Well, as you know, I'm a music journalist to begin with. So I started collecting albums when I was younger, going back to the early 70s. I even have some 45s going back to the early 60s. And I'm the family collector. I kept everything. My older brother was the one who bought a lot of the original records, and I kept them all. I have all the Beatles albums. I wouldn't give them up.
Amazing. Is there, well, you mentioned the Beatles, but is there any other favorite pieces of vinyl that you have that you're really proud of?
Well, there are unique pieces like my orange vinyl, Are You Experienced from China? Things like that that are really offbeat. But I would say, I'm a big James Brown fan. And so I did a lot of James Brown collecting during the years when I was writing about him. So I have about 60 James Brown albums. Pretty much whenever I would go collecting, I would go to the Bees and add on to James Brown albums I didn't have.
Whoa, amazing. Well, I want to go really, really way back. I mean, obviously, before your advocacy, before your music journalism, I just recently learned that you ran a concession stand at an amphitheater. How old were you and which amphitheater? Yeah, tell us about that.
It's the Schaefer Music Festival in New York. People who grew up in New York will know this. Those of us, the baby boom generation, will know it because it was the festival that took place in the Woolman skating rink on 59th Street, on the 59th Street side of Central Park. It's still there. They don't have the concerts there anymore, but these concerts turned into essentially the summer stage shows that are also in the park and another section of the park. So this was the original concert series in Central Park dating back to the late 60s, early 70s. And those years when I was in high school, I had a job working at the Boathouse in Central Park, which is only about 12 blocks away, 72nd Street Boathouse. And the company, Restaurant Associates, also had the concession for the skating rink. And while I was working there that spring, the concerts began in late June, and the boss one day got us all together and said, who wanted to work at the skating rink? And I was, me. I didn't really know much about the festival, though it had been going on for several years, but I went for it, and I worked the whole summer there. I saw every concert, 2-3 shows a night, 2-3 shows a week, two shows a night. It was, I worked the concession stand upstairs and the $1 seats. The downstairs seats were $2, but the low ticket prices don't let that make you think there weren't great bands. I mean, I saw everybody there: Jethro Tull, the Byrds, Van Morrison, Earl Guthrie. But it was a big variety of music. You could go one night from the Temptations, the next night Miss Peggy Lee. So it was really a fun mixture of jazz, R&B, and all the really hot new rock bands of the moment.
Wow. So you were like basically in your teenage years when you did that.
Yeah, it was very. It was a big thing for me to see all that music at once. It really did inspire me to go into a career that involved music, not as a musician, but writing about it.
Incredible. I have to ask you, when was your introduction to marijuana? Like, when was the first time you actually took a puff of marijuana?
I was 15 in high school. A friend of mine gave me some hash. And I went upstairs. I live in an apartment building, and he said to find a pipe that my father would have, because most of our fathers smoked tobacco or pipes or something back in those days. So they all had something hiding around. And I knew where my dad's pipes were. So I grabbed the pipe, and he told me to put some silver foil on and poke some holes, and then put the hash in it and light it up and smoke it. And I was on the roof of the building, and I guess hash is a little hard to inhale, and I wasn't used to smoking anything at that time, didn't smoke cigarettes. So nothing happened the first 2 times. I went up on the roof twice, but the third time was the charm, because a friend of mine, after school one day, we came back to my apartment, and he had a joint. And that wasn't necessarily the plan, but he came back and hey, here's a joint. And so we started smoking. We just rolled on the floor, laughing hysterically about every little thing, and eating everything available in the refrigerator. It was fun. So it took my third time to have my breakthrough.
Wow. And then you've been hooked ever since. And
I don't like to use the word hooked.
I'm
hooked on marijuana. Marijuana is not addictive.
No. So I think I was reading somewhere you were on way before you even tried marijuana. You were actually going through MySpace or something. I was reading something about you going on MySpace, something about women and weed, where they were showing all these models being photographed with loads of weed and I don't know. You were following some MySpace channel, is that right? Before you even tried it, so you were like, I want to get into this program. I was reading that somewhere. No?
I don't know.
Nothing about a MySpace channel?
First of all, our time frame's way off. I'm talking about when I was 15, and
Right.
MySpace is when I was, in my 40s or whatever. So I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Yeah, I was reading something about MySpace and
I was
girls
on
in
MySpace like everybody, pre
yeah, girls
and stuff.
in
but I
weed or
don't
something.
I don't recall that.
So you get into music journalism and you start writing for Rolling Stone, you're writing for Soho Weekly, you're writing for Newsday and all of that. Do you remember your first actual interview and who that was with? Do you remember that?
Well, I don't know, maybe my first, I have to really think back to first, but the one that case stands out a bit because it was sort of breakthrough for me. I was pretty young and it was a good opportunity. I started writing for Downbeat. And that was pretty amazing to get into Downbeat at that age in my kind of mid-20s without much of a background in jazz. But I was able to get in the door there. And I got in the door there by covering more commercial jazz. Most of the Downbeat writers were into, mainstream, traditional or progressive jazz, but they really weren't into commercial jazz. And I kind of was covering that to some degree when I started covering music. And so I got an assignment to interview Grover Washington Jr. And that was a real fun interview. I went to Philadelphia and I did it at his house, a gated house in Philadelphia. He was very popular at that time, had a lot of success with crossover jazz music. And that was my first real significant celebrity interview I think I did with anybody where that was a cover story. So it was kind of a breakthrough for me.
Wow, that's amazing. So out of all of you've done so many incredible stories over the years. I want you to talk about James Brown. You've had a very special bond over the years with James Brown from back in the day. And can you tell us how that came to be, and then some interesting James Brown stories that I'm sure you have?
Well, just to sort of back up a little bit, I got in the door as a music journalist writing about R&B and jazz. You look at me and you think, what would I know about this subject? But it was something I really dove into in the mid 70s. My dad was a big jazz fan, so he taught me a lot. And then I learned my own stuff as well. And then I really dove into R&B in the mid 70s. I grew up with the Beatles and the rock era. And then by the early 70s, I started to sort of lose a little interest in that. And R&B, funk, soul was just huge in New York. WBLS, the radio station, was blasting it. And, this is like the great era from about 72 to 75, 76 pre-disco. And I just fell in love with, Kool and the Gang, Earth, Wind and Fire, the Commodores, BT Express, just name them, all the great singers, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, all the female singers, Gladys Knight, Patti LaBelle, whatever, just name them all. And I was into them. And then going into disco as well, I covered that. And so during that period of time, James Brown was sort of lagging. His career was kind of lagging, and he did a disco album, the original Disco Man, and things really weren't going that well for James Brown at that time. He wasn't playing in New York. He wasn't selling a lot of records. His career had sort of come down from its late early 70s peak. This was by 79, and people really weren't paying much attention to him. I got an assignment from my editor to interview James Brown. And it sort of came out of the blue. I thought I knew enough to interview him, and I went for a first interview, and the publicist told me that James Brown wasn't there. So he had blown up the interview, and he went to the airport to meet somebody. So I asked the publicist, where is he staying? And he was staying at the Sherry Netherlands. So I went and stalked him at the Sherry Netherlands. He came walking in about a half hour later, and I went over to a guy who looked like a manager, and I said, hey, I'm Steve Bloom, supposed to interview James Brown. And he said, okay. And he put me in a room, and he said, James Brown will be in a few minutes. And James Brown came in, and he was in no mood for that interview. He just barked and yelled at me and who are you and why are you here? Not to mention maybe looking at my skin color and thinking, what does this guy know anything about R&B or soul music? So he wasn't in the mood. He canceled the interview in the middle. He just stopped. He said, end interview. He got mad at me about something or other. I wasn't really sure why, but and then the manager took me out for dinner for the next 3 hours and told me James Brown's story. He says, don't worry about him. He's just in a bad mood today. Come back tomorrow morning. I came back at 9 a.m. I never do interviews at 9 a.m. with any musician. I was at 9 a.m. with James Brown, spent the whole day with him. His hair was in curlers, and we just had a great day together. And from that point on, we just bonded. And then the story came out. He loved the story. He liked that I quoted him, as he said, verbatim. He said some kind of weird things in the story too, but I didn't take it out. And he just loved it. And he just said, you could always call me day or night. And when I saw him again, he was like my best friend. So from that point on, I mean, he wasn't a best friend, but I had great access to James Brown in the late 70s, early 80s, up until living in America, 84. Then he went to jail in 86, 87. And then I'd see him periodically as he'd play BB King's in New York, until he died in 2006. But even to the very end, he was always very nice to me. He always signed autographs for friends. He brought me into concerts with people. He did so many things that proved to people that I did really know James Brown. Over and over again, he would do things and people say, oh, wow, all these stories you're telling are true. He gave me a shout out at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco one time. He said, Steve Blue from Soho News is here. I mean, it was just so many different things that James Brown did. He just, we just sort of bonded in some weird way at a time when James Brown's career was a little bit low and he needed a little bit of a boost. And so it was people like me and, believe it or not, John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd and the Blues Brothers, who once said to me, he was very thankful to me and Danny Aykroyd, because we had kind of, recognized him at a low point in his career. So I don't know, it was something like that, but I had really an inside track. And anytime I went to a show, when James Brown started to play more and more in New York in the early 80s, I always went backstage. I knew all the people in his entourage. They were very nice to me. And sadly, Danny Ray, his MC, recently passed away. And Danny Ray was a great guy too. So I just had a great insight into the James Brown world. I was very lucky to be allowed to be in there and to be, kind of the fly on the wall.
Wow, incredible stories there. You are truly blessed. I have to shout out some people. There's a lot of people in the room, lots of friends. Michelle Amar, we've got Shirley Halperin, executive editor of Variety magazine. We have Nira Paliwada. We've got Little Kids Rock in the house. They just had a big VIP event last night that I'm seeing that a lot of people said was really excellent. Dick Wingate's in the house. Goodness, yeah, a lot of really fun people. Steve Shaw is in the house. Steve did, I guess Steve looked after James Brown's publishing, if I'm not mistaken, at some point. Let's see, Michael Kaufman's in the house. He does the Clio Awards, music and cannabis. That's his beat. Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Judith Miller's in the house. I love this, seeing all these friends and fam. Michelle Shocked. Wow, great. Okay, you know what, Steve? I want to find out, how many times have you seen the Grateful Dead? How many times did you see the Grateful Dead? Like, when was your first Dead show? And then how many times after that did you go? Did you travel around seeing them?
Well, it was actually that summer when I worked at the park. I went to shows all summer in the park, and there was a similar festival taking place in my neighborhood up in the Bronx at Gaelic Park. They had a series of concerts that were very similar to the Fillmore lineups and the Central Park lineups. We had 2-3 great bands on a bill. But I worked that whole summer, and turned out that at the end of the summer, when the concerts were over in the park, I was able to go see the Dead on August 26th. Deadheads remember the day, 1970. One was my first Dead show, right in my neighborhood. I walked to the show. It was really a treat. So it started there, my love of the Dead. But the next night I saw Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and they blew me away too, by the way. But I didn't become an ELP head, so to speak, because there wasn't a scene around ELP like there was around the Dead. I traveled across country in 72 and saw the Dead in Berkeley. Now back then, more like these days, people put up their finger and they want a miracle because the tickets are hard to get, at least when they were still having shows. Back then, we just walked in for $10 and got a ticket. It wasn't such a big deal. The Dead were playing a whole run of shows and we went to one of them. So I saw them then, and then I came back to New York after some travels and finished college, and I would just see them periodically in the New York area. And then as time went on, as I told you, I sort of got out of the rock scene and got more into R&B, soul, blues, jazz, disco, and I kind of left the Dead behind a little bit. And I saw them in '79 at the Garden. They really didn't sound very good to me. They were slowed down and they didn't have the energy they had 8 years ago before, and I didn't see him again for 10 more years until I started working at High Times. And when I got to High Times, you would think there would be a lot of interest in the Dead at High Times, but there really wasn't. Most of the people there were into other styles of music. There really weren't any Deadheads on staff. So I kind of jumped in and became the staff Deadhead, and I started to go to a lot of shows then. So from 90 to 95, but when Jerry died, I probably went to 20, 30 shows. So, I mean, in my career, including Dead and Company and other versions of the Dead, Phil Lesh's groups, I've probably, been to upwards of 100 dead shows in that range. So yeah, count me as a deadhead, but that's not my only favorite group, I'll tell you that.
Right. I've never seen the Dead. I've never even seen Dead and Company either. Nope, never. I've never seen Fish. I know. I've seen everybody else, but those are the three I've not seen. I know.
I'm
But my
also,
brot's a massive Deadhead fan and a massive
also,
Fish fan.
I'm also a
What's
big
that?
Fish fan. I'm also a big Fish fan. I can thank Shirley Halpern to some degree for that.
I was going to ask, oh my God, there's so many things I want to talk about here. 420, because you're talking about the Dead. You somehow stumbled upon a flyer. You saw the code and you were like, what is this? This is interesting, 420, right? You go to your editor at High Times at the time, and this whole thing turns into the celebrated International Weed Day, 420. I mean, I'd love to hear that story.
Well, I like to say I discovered 420 because I was at the Dead Show in 1990 in Oakland Coliseum. They would do a run of shows leading up to their New Year's show, say 4 shows. And I was out there, I believe it was December 28th, and I was walking around the parking lot. And there was a big scene at the Dead parking lot, everybody knows. It was a fun thing to do. You didn't even have to go to a show, you just hang out in the parking lot. And somebody was giving out this particular flyer, which told the story of 420, which I never heard about, knew nothing about. And the flyer, which I don't have in front of me right now, basically said that 420 was a code for a marijuana arrest in progress. And so they wanted to essentially flip the script and let's get high at 420 as, you know, just as a response to, you know, to the so-called arrests that were happening, the 420 code. They also said in the flyer that 420 is the day of all days, the highest of all holidays. And that's the day when everybody should get together. 420 on 420, 420ing together around the world. And that is what will happen next Tuesday, 420. They predicted the 420 holiday, the idea of everybody getting together, you know, big events, everybody smoking and connecting worldwide or nationwide or just within your own small group of friends. But the storyline around the code was debunked several years later. So I came back with a flyer to High Times, told everybody about it. Nobody ever heard of 420. I was the first in the High Times crowd. And so, and then we published the flyer in the news section where I was the editor at the time. And it was just basically verbatim the flyer. So it just worked its way through the magazine and through the culture gradually, where there were more and more 420 references. And then came about 1995, 1996, when Steve Capper, who's one of the so-called Waldos, who claimed to coin the term 420, stepped forward to say that there's no such code. And we never really researched it, to be honest. So he said there wasn't, and as it turned out, there wasn't. So that code proved to be, that first storyline proved to be false. They claim to have come up with a term, something they were doing after school. 420 was a time they got together. They went to San Rafael High School in Northern California, in Marin, which is sort of central area for the Deadheads back then. The Dead were San Francisco based, but then moved up to Marin. And so everybody used to hang out the Grateful Dead house up in Marin. And so 420 sort of caught on up there. The Waldos and other Deadheads started to spread it around. The weird thing was that 20 years went by and nothing was really said. It was very quiet. It was nothing we heard about. It was nothing that was ever mentioned until the flyer. So I give the flyer a lot of credit. The Waldos may have come up with the term. The flyer was the thing that really opened the door to people having any understanding of what 420 meant at all.
Crazy. It's such a wild story. And speaking of 420, I mean, do you have any, what are you doing on 420? Anything special?
Well, you know, we're still in the pandemic in New York and elsewhere, so it's really not wise to get together in large crowds, and people should not be sharing joints, by the way, anywhere. But New York has never been a haven for 420 events. There are a few things happening, and I may go out, depending on, you know, just whether I really want to hang out with people. It might be a good idea to show my face, even if I don't hang out too long. So I think everybody's a little hesitant to get together in crowds for 420. So I think it's more of a personal thing this year. Just there's so many online events, there's so many streaming events, Cyprus Hill and Burner and Melissa Etheridge and Doug Benson, and Weed Maps has their Hire Together program. There's so much just to do, sit in front of the computer like we are now and just enjoy the day at home.
Yeah. Speaking of Cyprus Hill, great relationship with Cyprus Hill. I mean, you've covered them for years. I mean, it's starting at High Times. What's your relationship obviously you're still in touch, and what are some proud moments of working with Cyprus Hill over the years and covering them from the beginning?
Well, my proudest moment is putting them on the cover of High Times in March 1992. It really opened the door to bands appearing in High Times during the 90s. When we put Cyprus Hill on the cover, and then later that year, the Black Crowes, it opened the door wide to other bands, seeking that same type of publicity. And we really weren't that aware that bands were really that much into the magazine until those doors opened. So Cyprus was the first. I'm sort of proud in multiple ways with Cyprus, because I think Cyprus and Redman and Wu-Tang and a lot of the New York groups really were a bridge connecting cannabis and the hip hop community.
Right.
And there really wasn't a big diversity in cannabis back then, and hip hop really swung open the door. And in the case of Cypress Hill being a Latin hip hop group with connections to Cuba and Mexico, and their DJ was just a guy from Queens, an Italian kid from Queens, but so they had real interesting culty group. But it was Howard Wolfing, a publicist at Columbia and Rough House, who opened that door and came to High Times and said Cypress Hill would be a good interview for you guys. And they had already established a friendship with NORML, the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws, by being their spokesband, which was something new. So it was just a good opportunity for us to work with those guys. I remember seeing them before we did the interview, it was maybe the night before. They played at the Apollo Theater, and Cypress Hill was the last band on the bill, like the fifth band. They were the opener. It was like Naughty by Nature, Black Sheep, all those really cool bands of the early 90s. They were really ticked off. I remember they were mad, being disrespected. They already had maybe a Killer Man and a few songs out there, but they were just blowing up, but they were considered a West Coast group. And so the East Coast people didn't really know Cypress Hill, so they slightly disrespected them. And then they kind of, look at the history now. I mean, I love Black Sheep and Naughty by Nature, but Cypress Hill, still exists 30 years later. They deserve the headline bill. But that next morning, they showed up right on time for the photo shoot. No delay, no nonsense. They were really gung ho. So doing that photo shoot, the original photos, they had a roll of blunt centerfold with Be Real, which really opened that door to blunt rolling and blunt smoking. That was the beginning of a really great friendship with the band, especially Be Real, who I've kept in touch with over the years. But I've always been friendly with Sendog, Bobo, Muggs, all of them. It's just nice to be able to, all these years later, to still connect with those guys. Muggs is not with them anymore. It's Mixmaster Mike is their DJ, which just makes them that much greater. They're a terrific show, and they are doing a 420 live stream. So I recommend people check it out. In addition, by the way, Be Real is now becoming a cannabis industry mogul. He owns 6 Dr. Green Thumb dispensaries in Southern and Northern California, and they're opening one in Oklahoma City soon. So he's spreading out like his buddy Berner, who owns Cookies, is.
Whoa, okay. Snoop Dogg is spreading out like that too, right? Snoop Dogg? I think
not doing stores though. Snoop is, was really one of the first, or if not the first, to start a celebrity cannabis brand, Leaps by Snoop. But he's never gone into the dispensary business, which is where Be Real and Berner had gone.
Got it. Speaking of Cypress Hill, I remember distinctly that cover, the High Times cover. That was incredible. And I think it was the 25th anniversary of High Times, if I'm not mistaken, at Irving Plaza, where they performed. Is that right?
That's true.
I remember that show. That was incredible.
I actually introduced them that night. I gave like a 2-minute speech, and I remember, I'm an okay public speaker, but I don't remember things that well in terms of remember. So I really have to really study up. I remember standing out like in a park in my neighborhood, just reciting it over and over again when nobody was there, just so I got it right. But that night I nailed it. And it was Woody Harrelson was there that night, Jack Herrer, Joan Jett. We had a really fun night.
Loads of celebrities there that night. Right. South by Southwest, I remember going to some of your parties at South by Southwest. You did some incredible events during the High Times era in the Lower East Side, the East Village. I mean, some of your brownies were so memorable. I mean, I used to take my friends to all the parties, and we all just went home so happy. I'm just trying to think though, Steve, how did we meet? Do you remember? Because I know I would pitch you countless times on some of the artists that I was representing. Do you remember a band called Space Needle? Because I was dying to get Space Needle in the High Times book. And I think you were saying it's a little too soon, not enough about them yet. And I would just keep going and hounding like I do. And I don't know if you went to that infamous Brownies show that everybody was at, everybody from like Rolling Stone to, you know, New York Times to Us Weekly, Entertainment Weekly. I mean, everybody was there to watch that Space Needle show. Were you there too?
That sounds familiar.
I feel like you were in the room as well. Anyway, so I think I remember just talking to you on the phone and emailing you and just not harassing you, but just being the relentless publicist that I am. But I'm trying to think of when we officially met. I know I was, you know, friends with Shirley Halpern at the time that had Smug magazine. And I don't know if it was Shirley that introduced us or we met at a party and she was there and you were there. I'm just still trying to figure out how we met, but it's been years and years and years. I know.
Well, Shirley's here. Let Shirley get on, and maybe she can tell. I don't really recall the specifics, but I was a little bit of a hard sell at High Times to get bands in the magazine. You just had to be very specifically, catered to High Times. Many publicists would call kind of clueless. They didn't really even know what the magazine was about, but their band told them to get in touch, and then they didn't really sort of, so sometimes, I remember Ziggy Marley was a good example of how somebody I wanted to get into the magazine, and I went to the publicist at Virgin, and they what's High Times? They didn't have a clue. And Bob Marley loved the magazine, so I figured it was a natural, to get Ziggy in there. It's like on my kind of bucket list of artists I wanted to interview was Ziggy. I love the Melody Makers, and I thought that was a natural for the magazine. But the beauty of it was I kind of planted the seed with the publicist, and then for the next album, she called me saying that Ziggy wants to do it. So the publicist did the right thing, even though she may not have been aware of High Times. She told Ziggy that High Times had made a request, and then Ziggy said, "I want to do it." And then she got back to me. So that's the way the publicist should do things, and not tell the artist. Tell the artist that the request is there, even if they don't know what it's about or agree with it.
Right. You spoke about the Waldos earlier in to do with the 420, obviously back then in San Rafael. But what about the Walden Brothers, so Capricorn Records? Because you actually produced some hempilation projects. It was one, Freedom is Normal. The other one was Free the Weed. Is that right? They were Free the Weed?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and that was with Capricorn. So how did that relation come to be, that relationship?
Well, those are the two hempilation albums that I co-produced with Normal and Capricorn. It was my idea. I was, doing music coverage at High Times, and my background as a music journalist. There were a lot of benefit albums coming out in the late 80s, early 90s. I remember Sweet Relief was one of them. And I just thought that maybe it was time for a benefit album for the legalization movement. And High Times worked very closely with Normal. So I came back from one particular event that I was at, and where Chrissy Hynde was there and River Phoenix. They were promoting, I think, one of the Sweet Relief albums. And I just came back, and I don't remember who I told it to, but I just said, why not an album like this? Or I love the albums like Dedicated, which was, a tribute album to the Grateful Dead. So it wasn't a benefit album, but so the benefit albums would be, a certain theme, and, to ask artists, to donate songs. The Dedicated was more specific to the Grateful Dead and got a bunch of artists playing covers of the Dead. So my idea was to get artists together to play covers of great marijuana songs. Or if you want to write your own, or if you have one that's your own, that's original, then we could consider that too. But the main thing was to get people to cover, legalize it, One Toke Over the Line, songs like that, and get new versions. So that's really what I came up with hempilation, was that idea. Went to Normal. Normal liked it. They needed money desperately back then. So any way to raise money, they were gung-ho. So they were way behind it. And then we just needed to find a partner. Now, we had a meeting with Def Jam in New York. That was pretty hysterical with Leor Cohen. Again, clueless, and not an idea at all of what we were about, just wanted to make money. And me and Eric Steenstra, who was my Normal partner, walked out of that meeting shaking our head like, if this is the industry we're trying to deal with, we're never going to sell this idea to anybody. But as it turned out, we found Capricorn, and Capricorn was a great fit because, first of all, Capricorn had a reputation for being somewhat of a counterculture record company. A lot of drugs ran through that company and through the bands, the Allman Brothers and all the different groups that were on the label back in the 70s. Phil Walden had a great reputation working with Jimmy Carter to help him get elected. They just had a great reputation. The label went under and came back in the early 90s, reinvigorated with cool new bands like Cake and 311, plus they had Widespread Panic, they had Vic Chestnut, Government Mule, and they turned into a great partner. I forget the connector, how it happened, but we got a connection with them. We ended up going down to Nashville when they had an office in Nashville before they moved back to Georgia, and we had a meeting there and sold them on it. Me and my partner from Normal, and Phil Walden was really gung-ho. What I loved about Capricorn and why I think I related so well to them was that it was a family operation. I mean, almost everybody in that office was named Walden, and it reminded me of High Times. High Times was kind of a family operation, a small group of like 30 people, working really hard to do something important. And Capricorn was like that too. Trying to kind of bring back the Capricorn vibe from the 70s. So we kind of connected, and it just worked. And my partner there was Philip Walden Jr., Phil's son. So it was me, Eric Steenstra, for the second album, Harvey Schwartz and Eric and myself, Philip and Harvey teamed up to put together, you get all the groups together for the album. And so the first one did really well. It was considered, it was treated by the drug czar as the problem with the music industry. The drug czar attacked the Hempelation album. He held it up at a meeting of record company executives in Hollywood and said, "This is what's wrong with your industry. You're releasing albums like this that encourage people to use drugs and marijuana." The sales went through the roof thanks to the drug czar. And we had a few other bands that helped sales too, because I would stir up articles and people would want to get the album because they were wondering why they were telling people they couldn't get this album. So the album was the first album had Cyprus Hill, Ziggy Marley, 311, Sublime, Black Crowes, Widespread Panic, trying to think of some of the other big name, Blues Traveler. We had a really great lineup of like all the hot 90 bands from 1995. Blues Traveler was very hot then, Sublime were very hot, 311, they all having hit singles. So we just, got, and really Capricorn was pretty cool. They didn't demand, maybe 3 of their artists were on the record, and we had 17 songs on the first, and the rest was up to us to fill it out. And we did that. I did most of it. I mostly through my connections at High Times to find bands like Blues Traveler. We knew them in New York. I knew Bobby Sheehan, the bass player, a little bit. I brought it to his attention. He brought it to the band's attention. Next thing you know, I got a call saying they want to do it. Next thing we're discussing what song. Next thing they submit a version of I Want to Take You Higher, which was fabulous. So it was really a lot of fun, to work with the bands and, suggest something. And then all of a sudden it happens.
Amazing. Was this also during the time that you produced the Doobie Awards and the Stonies movies and TV as well? Is that around the same era?
Those came later. I mean, I sort of was wearing multiple hats at High Times. Like you said, South by Southwest, started doing events. So every year at South by Southwest, we do the famous High Times party. And everybody was a stoner at South by Southwest, being locals or the industry people all wanted to be at that party. If you remember, we were at the Vibe for many years, and that party would go all day long. They had to throw us out so they could start having their regular bands that night, because we could go all day and all night. People were having such a good time. So I mean, with all the different events that I was doing in New York, we were doing events at Wetlands. We did one big one at the Limelight with like a kind of a mixture of Skid Row and Pantera with Sebastian Bach and Dimebag Darrell. And then the Bad Brains were on that bill. We were raising money for Normal back then. We were calling them Rock for Pot. And then the ones down in Texas were raising money. That were just promotional. So I would just have my, hat on doing different things. I always liked doing events. And I even did that a little bit when I was in college. And so I came up with the idea for the Stonies, which was basically, a little bit of a joke on the Tonys, but it wasn't a theater show. It was a movie and television show. And at that time, I was doing all the music stuff, but I steered towards movies as well as kind of broaden out the celebrities that could possibly appear in High Times. That could be actors, directors, be Ice Cube for Friday. It could be Rory Cochrane for Dazed and Confused. So, we started doing more movie covers back then. And so that's where the Stonies came out of, the idea of, covering this, but also identifying the best movies, the best actors, the best smoking scenes, the best dialogue, the best music, and hail that, for, all the great stuff that was being done back then. And it was a really good era. The late 90s and early 2000s was a really great era for stoner movies. It's sort of like gone downhill a little bit lately, but it really was peaking back then. I'd say 98 to say 2008 was a really great run. And so that's when I started doing that award show, and we did it small scale, and then we moved it to BB King's, and then it became a little bit of a bigger event. And then we did the Doobies, which is a music version of that, which was just a little simpler idea of like, stoner music, and a lot of great bands. And we also started that one at Wetlands and moved that one to BB King's also.
Right.
So
I went to one of those. I went to a couple of your Doobies. Yeah. Speaking of the music, what are some of your favorite songs to get high to? Like, you must have your go-to, like, listen to music.
My number one is Legalize It, because I think Legalize It, just defines the whole movement. This is what it's all about. Every other song is fun. You want to talk over the line. I love it, but it's a cute song and everything, but it's not really about specifically the efforts to legalize marijuana. That's really an advocacy song, doctors smoke it, I mean, it says so much in that song. And all these years later, it's 1976. Think about that now, 45 years ago, finally legalizing marijuana, thanks in part to, Peter Tosh.
And what about movies? What are some of your movies that you like?
I have a 1-2. I have a 1-2 favorites. Shirley Halpern and I also wrote the book Reefer Movie Madness, the Ultimate Stoner Film Guide, and we dove, head first into the whole idea of stoner movies and what's best and what's not so good too. We rated all the movies, and some of them we didn't like so much, but the ones we like the most, the one I like the most, I have my theory on stoner movies, that stoner movies, generally is about drugs in the cinema, and in this case, usually marijuana, and how marijuana is depicted, and you determine, whether you like it or not, depending on these depictions and the portrayals of the characters. But number one for me is Easy Rider. Because Easy Rider is the beginning of this whole era of the stoner movie, or the drug movie. In this case, all kinds of different drugs in that movie, from marijuana, the famous campfire scene with Nicholson, and then the famous, cemetery, scene with the LSD. That was never done before in any movies. And if marijuana is ever depicted pre-1969, it was always negative. And in this case, it was just like guys sitting around getting to know each other and tripping a little bit on the stars in the sky while they're camping out. So that was, that to me is just the greatest stoner movie of all time. Number two is Up in Smoke.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's two different types of stoner movies. There's the serious stoner movie, which Easy Rider really was. They got killed at the end. They're the anti-heroes. And then there's the ha-ha, buddy stoner movie, where two guys or women or whatever team and group of people get together and go on some nutty adventure. So Up in Smoke is the beginning of that. So it's the first of that style of two guys going on a nutty adventure with a lot of weed smoke and whatever else is going on. And you build a storyline around that. And it is their best movie by far. So, those are my two. Everything sort of springs from those two movies, in my opinion.
Got it. Can you tell us some Willie Nelson stories? I know you've got a few.
Well, I love Willie. I mean, at High Times, we were knocking on Willie's door quite a bit. And, Willie in the early 90s was not very accessible. He was having problems with the IRS, and he wasn't quite as popular as he is right now. It's a little bit like James Brown, his career was down and had to go back up. And so it was a little bit of a down there. But, Willie was just starting to express, his interest in marijuana legalization, and especially an interest in hemp. And he had a favorite candidate for governor in Kentucky named Gatewood Galbraith, who was running for governor on a hemp platform, so to speak. He was pro-marijuana and very pro-hemp. And Kentucky is famous for hemp growing, going back to the 1800s. So they were sort of trying to revive the idea of hemp growing in Kentucky. And Willie jumped on that bandwagon. And we drove to Kentucky, to Lexington one day when Willie was doing a couple of appearances for Gatewood. and a concert that night. And so we met up with Willie there and did some photos and put him on the cover with Gatewoods. That was the kind of the beginning of my relationship with Willie. And then from that point on, we kept on knocking on Willie's door a lot to see whether we could get him in the magazine, but for one reason or not, he wasn't accessible. And it's funny, we mentioned Shirley a couple of times here, but I remember Shirley and I were at South by Southwest one year, and we waited outside that bus for an hour and couldn't get in. At least there was a lot of celebs on the bus after some show. What was the Backyard he was playing, and so he. We were told, it was like Jessica Simpson, all kinds of people were on that bus. They weren't going to let the stoners on the bus to report who else was on the bus. So they kept us off the bus. And I kept on trying. In New York, I'd meet after the shows and Willie would come outside. It was this thing, I just had to get on that bus. Steve Bloom High Times never been on the Willie Nelson bus. So years go by, I'm not on that bus. And finally, post High Times, I was writing for Freedom Leaf magazine. Then I was editor of the magazine, and Willie was coming to Atlantic City, and one of the other people on the magazine really wanted to interview Willie. So I knocked on the door again, and the door opened, and they set up the interview with us on the bus at Atlantic City. It's might be the last time I saw Willie, unless I saw Willie at a Farm Aid. But that was great. So I finally got on the bus and smoked with Willie, took a joint out, and we lit it up, right out of Willie's stash. So finally got that done. I don't have to bother Willie anymore, And,
Love it.
and anyway, Willie probably shouldn't be touring and traveling that much more anyway. I know he's got some shows on the schedule, but it's going to be a limited year for him.
Yeah, I love that. I love that story. Actually, before we get into the advocacy stuff and Freedom Leaf and everything else that you've been doing to get legalization here in New York, finally, New York State, pot culture. I love this book. It's the Bible. It's the Bible of everything hemp, weed, etc., everywhere in the world, really. And you and Shirley Halperin co-authored it. How did this come to be? How did this happen? How did you write this? And how long did it take? And what are your favorite parts of that book?
Well, I was sort of halfway out the door at High Times then. I was sort of in a part-time relationship with High Times after being the co-editor for a couple of years, and they kept on kind of making changes. And so I stepped away from my full-time position and closed up my office at High Times and moved back home. And I was sort of working on a retainer. And Shirley came to me with the idea for pot culture. That wasn't even the name initially. It was her idea. She, conceived this glossary of terms for cannabis, and also the idea of like an extended cultural section in the back that would cover movies and music and all kinds of fun historical things about marijuana. And Shirley, wanted some help. We had teamed up at High Times a few years earlier. Shirley went on a different path to be an editor at different entertainment publications like Billboard and now at Variety. And so she needed a team player on this, and she asked me to join. And I liked the idea, and I had time in my schedule to work on a book, and I thought it was a great idea. So we just started working on this proposal. The proposal probably took around 6 months. We went back and forth, back and forth. We had an agent, Sarah Lazen, who helped us quite a bit, shaping the proposal. And when it was finally done, it went out for auction, into the industry. We got 2 offers, and we took the offer from oh my God.
Oh, you're looking for the book? Yes.
Oh my God, Shirley's be mad at me. From Abrams Image. We took the author from Abrams, and we went from there. We just worked really hard on that book. We spent a lot of time and even extra money to make it look just right. All the pretty pictures and the great cover, courtesy of Bamboo. That was just, it was success. To our great surprise. We put a lot of time and effort into it, but the book sold in the range of 75,000 copies, which is really quite good for any book, but especially a cannabis book. So we're very proud of that. And my favorite part of it, we just have a lot of really fun sidebars in there and a lot of fun interviews with people. The A to Z is really interesting. Obviously, it's getting a little bit dated because we wrote the book 12, 13 years ago. So we need to add some terms, but up until that point of time, it was very accurate. And now, we did try to update the book, but the company didn't let us. So we just had to leave it as it is. So this version of it is the only version you'll ever see. There'll never be another update of pop culture, unfortunately.
Well, I just actually ordered a couple more books for some birthday gifts on Amazon. So Tommy Chung did the forward. That's pretty wild too, right? Tommy did the forward. I forgot to say, by the way, I just want to go back real quick because I told you there was a message from a guy from China that I thought was really, really cool, who shouted you out, who was your cartoonist, remember, from that video game, from the video games magazine that you did back in the day, because you did books on basketball and video, right? Video games.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, you're referring to Gene Williams, I believe.
Yes, it's crazy. He found me. And he told me to tell you hello.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I didn't really know Gene too well, but it's one of my sort of detours in my career. When I was writing about music in the, my career began in the late 70s writing about music. And it was a lot of fun. It was a good period, great time, in the industry. It was lots of parties and lots of perks and lots of albums and, occasional junkets flying you around to places and stuff like that. But I found, with all the freebies and stuff, we didn't get paid very well. We just got, we were writing reviews for $10 and stuff like that, but we get all kinds of good freebies. So that kind of like added on to, the enjoyment of what we were doing, but I really wasn't making much of a living. So I kind of just started to veer off. Actually, I was still at the Soho News, and I came up with the idea of the video game story because I was an arcade kind of guy. I liked the arcades at Times Square when I was growing up in New York. And so I liked skee ball and games like that. And so the video games started popping up in the late 70s, and I was at one of the arcades and I noticed a big crowd around the Space Invaders machine. And I came back and, I hung around there for a while and saw there was a little thing going on here. And I went back to one of my editors of the Soho News and said, hey, I think there's something to write about the new video game phenomenon. And they said, sure, do it. And that was my other cover story in Soho News. I had a cover story on James Brown and a cover story on video games. And they called me Video Game Junkie.
Appropriately titled.
Right, exactly. So, and that I can agree. You could become a junkie when it comes to that, putting your quarters in, waiting, playing forever. So I just got into it. I was not the greatest video game player, but I just enjoyed them in general. I liked the overall idea of it. And it was something else for me to focus on. So I after writing that cover story, I got an offer from an agent to write a book about video games. And I came up with an idea of writing kind of an early history of video games. And that's what I did write, called Video Invaders. And on the heels of that, there was a new magazine called Video Games that was starting up, and I got that job to be editor. So it was my first editor job, and I met John Holmstrom, who was my connector to High Times via Video Games, because John Holmstrom is a cartoonist. He was the guy who started Punk magazine, and he did other cartoons. And he was doing cartoon illustrations reviews for heavy metal. And my editor for my video game book said, hey, there's this guy you should get in touch with who's doing these great, video game reviews. I contacted Heavy Metal, got in touch with John Holmstrom. John started doing his reviews for video games. And John knew all these great cartoonists. And that's how the video game started to have a series, including him. There was another great cartoonist named Peter Bagg. He had the Video Kid, that was a really funny one. And Gene Williams had a couple that were really good. And I think they all came through John. And it turns out John is my connector to High Times, because John ended up working at High Times in the mid 80s. And he's the one who hired me in 1988.
Crazy. It's all full circle. So we get from pot culture to going heavy into marijuana reform, advocacy, like full on hardcore, Freedom Leaf, everything else you've been doing. I mean, you played a major role in the legalization of recreational marijuana in New York State, finally. So you want to talk a little bit about all that work that you've done since High Times?
Well, I mean, it happened at High Times when I became an advocate. I really wasn't a legalization advocate prior to that. I was a smoker, a stoner. I didn't really know the laws very well. New York was pretty liberal. New York's decriminalization law was pretty liberal in the 70s. It was really hard to get arrested for marijuana back in those days. But things changed really dramatically in the 90s and the 2000s when Giuliani and Bloomberg were mayors in New York, and they turned New York into the marijuana arrest capital of the world. And so that really sort of lit the fire, to try and change the laws in New York. Obviously, organization have been working on that for years. My role is I have to honestly say is pretty minimal. I'm a journalist, I write about stuff, I help, I support, but really the heavy lifting is being done by NORML, the Drug Policy Alliance, the Marijuana Policy Project, Women Grow, all the different organizations out there now that have been doing, the heavy lifting. I just sort of write about it, but I also do offer my support. So I will take a little credit, but not too much.
You should definitely take a little bit more than a little credit, Steve. I mean, I've watched you all these years with your tireless efforts to get to where we are today. So
Well, I will say that,
Yep.
being an advocate, whether I'm wearing the journalist hat or just, being an organizer or a lobbyist, going back, to when I started working at High Times, I don't think there was a lot of respect for that decision. I think my family members and friends, and except my closest stoner friends, but, they didn't really get it. Like High Times was not a good career move for me. I should have been working at Rolling Stone or some other place. Well, I tell people, hey, Rolling Stone didn't hire me. They gave me assignments, but they never, said, hey, Steve, we have a job for you. Or I didn't petition for that. High Times hired me. And so they kind of brought me aboard, and that kind of, gave me a new path in my career.
right. And May the 1st, you are working on, this is yearly, I've gone to many of these events, your cannabis parade. And now this is post legalization. So what's that going to look like on May 1st? I mean, I know we're still in the COVID era, so it's got to be social distance and everything, but I know you have something planned. So
Well, I mean, I'm being somewhat humble about my role, but this is sort of a major role that I've taken on in the last couple of years to be one of the organizers of the New York City Cannabis Parade and Rally. It's an event I attended, over the years during my High Times years. It's an event that's going back to the early 70s when they were smoke-ins in Washington Square Park. And then that event has moved around quite a bit over the years. And now it is in Union Square Park with a parade that leads to a rally, usually takes place on the first Saturday of May. Last year we were canceled, and I came aboard 3 years ago. So I helped run the 2018 and 2019 events. This year, due to COVID, we can't have a major event. We can't have a big stage. We can't have a large crowd, but we can have a smaller event. For 200 is what we're allowed right now in the park, spaced out. We're going to tell people not to share joints. You can smoke, but you can't share. And we're going to basically try to have a press conference / mini rally. There is plans for a parade, which will not meet in the park because we can't crowd the park. We are negotiating with some major elected officials and to come and speak. In the past, we've had, a couple of years ago, we had Cynthia Nixon when she was running against Andrew Cuomo. We've had the public advocate Jumaane Williams the last few years. We've had Assemblyman Richard Gottfried regularly. We have assembly people, assembly members, council members, and all the different advocates in New York. So we're going to have to just sort of, squeeze it into an hour and a half program and hopefully get a couple of really big name elected officials to give us a little juice and get the press there.
like Chuck Schumer, fingers crossed.
He's on our list. Yeah.
Good. Yes.
High on our list.
Yes. Dick Wingate actually pointed out for 420, there's actually an event on Clubhouse. Peter Tosh's daughter, Niambe, is celebrating International Peter Tosh Day. And I guess Dick had something to do with that. He wrote the marketing plan to legalize it and equal rights albums, etc. So obviously the time of that is at 420 next Tuesday. So
very appropriate, tying Tosh to 420, very appropriate.
Are you on Clubhouse, Steve?
I am on Clubhouse, yeah.
Okay, good. I'll have to follow you on Clubhouse.
Yeah.
Goodness, we're running out of time. I feel like there's so many. I want to see if there's questions here. There's a lot of comments, a lot of people shouting you out, Steve. You've got lots and lots of fans over here, people, big admirers of your work. Wetlands was an amazing place. By the way, did you do stuff at Tramps? I mean, that was my go-to place too. I did loads at Tramps, loads at Wetlands. Did you do anything there?
Well, we didn't do any shows. I mean, I remember Steve Weitzman over there, but I love Tramps. I'll never forget like one of their late night Parliament P-Funk shows that went to like 3:30 or 4 in the morning. I remember people were just slumped on the floor, half asleep. It was just like, They would really wear you out. Yeah, those are fun. The 21st Street Tramps. There was also the original Tramps, what, down on 12th or something, or there was another one before that. Yeah, I mean, you think back to, I like the Lone Star in New York too. That was a classic. That was where James Brown used to play a lot, because he wasn't sort of getting into New York for some reason, and the Lone Star booked him. And then from that point on, he just played the Lone Star over and over again, despite the fact that the place was way too small for his 30 member band or whatever it was.
Oh, I'm just seeing a message from Shirley saying there's only 10 left in stock for Pot Culture, by the way, because I just bought 2 of them the other day.
Go get them, go get them.
Go get them, go get them, sell it out. All roads lead to Willie Nelson. Yes, they do, Michelle. NFTs, that's a whole nut. If we were to talk about NFTs, that's another 2-hour conversation. Are you hip to the non-fungible tokens? Are you?
I'm trying to learn about this, but I would not be the person to ask questions about it.
And that's fine, because we're running out of time anyway. There are a couple key questions that I still want to ask you. Actually, is there any kind of cultural differences in weed smoking across cultures? Just curious to know your thoughts on that. Like whether
sure. You should know. In England, people.
You to tell me, yeah.
In England, people mix, weed and tobacco, that's cultural. We don't do it. They do it in Jamaica. They roll spliffs, and we don't. So many things like that. Look at Jamaica. Everybody can just roll a joint in their hand like this. I can't. They could literally just, next thing you know, they make a joint out of it. That's not, I like to use a rolling machine. I cheat. So no, it varies definitely from culture to culture. I'm not around the world enough to say, how they do it in Brazil, but I'm sure it's different there than it is here.
Maybe that's your next book, travel from place to write about that. And I guess lastly, where do you see the cannabis industry's growth over the next few years?
Well, it's growing in leaps and bounds. Obviously, it's a sort of slightly a runaway train right now. And I guess they're trying to reel it in a little bit to make it fair and let everybody participate, because the runaway train is like, all the corporations get in and take it over. That's how America works. And what's happening in the legalization movement is like, slow it down a little bit, let everybody have a piece of the action, don't let it just be monopolized, which is what's sort of happened in the first few years of legalization. Big companies come in and monopolize it. So there's a really big effort to open up the door for everybody and make it a much more diverse and equitable industry. And so that's where things are going, and hopefully will head, and there'll be some progress in that area, because it hasn't been successful so far. The New York law is a good example of that, with opportunities for everybody, so to speak, and investment opportunities for those who can't afford, and grants and things like that to get people in the door so they're not shut out. This whole new wave and movement is about being fair to everybody, especially those who've been targeted by the war on drugs, who've spent time in jail, whose lives have been upended, due to their use of marijuana and the legal system and the way legal system has treated people, including myself. I've been arrested 3 times for marijuana. So things are changing dramatically. What's not changing on the state level dramatically very fast, but what's not changing is on the federal level, which is moving still fairly slowly with Congress. The way it's set up right now is not a lot of wiggle room for legalization at this point in time with a 50-50 Senate. There's just not enough support. There'll probably be even a Joe Manchin, a guy like that, wouldn't support legalization. So, the more conservative Democrats would not be behind it. Plus you have all the Republicans. It's become a totally partisan issue. Democrats for legalization, for marijuana, Republicans against. So when you look at it that way, on the federal level, it's going to still be hard to make significant federal changes in the next couple of years until, the Congress changes or there's more Democrats controlling things, and it's not such a fine margin to try and get anything done. So the states are going to keep moving. The last, just in the last week, we've had New York, Virginia, and New Mexico all passing. That's ridiculous. to happen so quickly through legislation. It was very hard to get legislatures to move on legalization. All of a sudden they're moving. And plus New Jersey passed recently too. So we've had a huge wave in the last year, and it's just going to keep happening in the states where it's liberal enough to happen. And it'll probably be a little more difficult in the more conservative states where they're probably going to just hold back. You know, the Idahos and Nebraskas of the world are probably going to just say no, continue to say no to legalization until federally the law comes in and tells them what they have to do. You know, on the state level, they can do what they want to do, and they can kind of keep it controlled and illegal if they want to, you know, or they can change their policy that way. So states good, federal not so much right now.
Right. And lastly, Steve, Bloom, where is the Bloom going? What's next for Bloom? What's next for you?
I have some book ideas. I haven't written another book since the movie guide that Shirley and I wrote. I have a couple of ideas that would be along the lines of bios. And I've always wanted to write a bio of an important person, something I haven't really done in my life. I did a sports book with some mini bios, but not like a full book about one individual. So I have my ideas on a few people, and I am negotiating with one particular person, but I won't say who because I don't want to hex it.
I think I have a vague idea. Well, this is great. I mean, I could talk to you for days. I mean, it's such an education. It's so, you know, impressive, your career. I mean, I haven't known you from the beginning, but I've known you for a good deal of your career. And just watching, you know, from the peripheral, seeing all the moves that you've made has been really inspiring, Steve. And I think you are an incredible human being. And thank you for all the work that you've done to get, you know, more people educated and informed about cannabis culture and hemp and CBD and everything along the way. And I look forward to what you're cooking up in the next few years. And thank you to everybody for tuning in. And thank you, Tom, smartest people in the room.
Thank you, Fiona, for all your support over the years. You're just, you know, one of the good people, and I just love publicists. They're some of my favorite people. Most of them are women, and you know, that's maybe another reason why I like publicists. But I just, you know, sometimes publicists close the door on things we want to do, but most of the time they're really, you know, getting us in there to do what we need to do and just, you know, do it their way. But it usually gets done, so I really appreciate it. And thanks for having me here today, Tom.
Amen to you both. First to Fiona, thank you so much for finally slowing down long enough to appear on this program. I've been chasing you for so long. I really appreciate all that you do and our friendship. And Steve, this has been an absolute pleasure. I've been an admirer of you from afar for a long time. So what a wonderful opportunity to introduce you to our audience. So thank you to the audience for your continued patronage here. We'll be back here on Tuesday with another kick-ass pairing, so please tune in. We're 30 minutes later on Tuesday, 2:30 Eastern, instead of the normal 2 o'clock time. Be nice to everybody, get a shot, and enjoy 420 in a dramatic way next week, folks. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.